Hi, I'm Deb Miller. I'm the director of the Public Management Center at the University of Kansas. I'm pleased to introduce this webinar series. We've missed engaging with you live and in person. Who knew something so common could now feel so precious and valued? Though not live and in person, we hope these webinars will provide you with a convenient outlet to continue learning, and in this now daily virtual way, connecting with other public sector professionals. Because they are pre-recorded, you can view the webinars as your schedule allows, share them with others if you choose, and listen to key points more than once. Each of our speakers has offered to make themselves available to answer your questions. If you have questions, please leave them in the chat or in the comments below. We will either connect you with the presenter or respond to you with an answer. Here at the PMC, we believe that public service lies at the heart of democracy. During these strange, uncertain times, you are doing democracy in ways you never imagined and finding workarounds you never expected to need. We salute you and hope that in some small way, we can support and assist you in your work.
Matt Tidwell is the Assistant Dean at the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kansas. He is also the Program Director for KU's Masters in Integrated Marketing Communications program. Prior to his academic career, Matt worked in marketing communications as a vice president at 2 Midwest communications agencies and served in communications leadership roles for companies including Great Plains Energy, St. Luke's Health Systems, and Sanofi Pharmaceuticals. At KU, Matt directs multiple graduate programs and teaches courses in relationship marketing, audience analysis, and crisis communications. He conducts academic research in crisis communications. He has a master's in communications management from Syracuse University and earned his Ph.D. at KU.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Pleasure to get a chance to speak to your organization today, and one of my favorite things to do. I think, as you may know, my name is Matt Tidwell. My day job is an assistant dean and program director at University of Kansas at the graduate level. Also do quite a bit of academic research and speaking around the topic of crisis communication. Spent more than 25 years in the profession in this area, so really excited to be with you all on this topic. And I thought before we began, I just want to cover just 2 or 3 quick sort of housekeeping notes before we get right into the presentation. The first one is that we're recording, obviously, today, but I'm more than happy, always more than happy to answer questions, work with organizations. I've done quite a bit of that over the last few years. If you see something in the presentation and it really just sort of sticks in your mind and becomes a burning question, watch for, at the end of the slide presentation, I'll give you my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if there's something that you'd like to talk about after we adjourn from the presentation here today. The second point I want to make is that I realize that as we're recording this in spring of 2020, we're all in the midst of what essentially is a global pandemic, and it's affecting our organizations very substantially. No question, probably more substantially than many of us can remember. And I don't want to ignore that fact, but I also know that we also are faced with other types of crises all the time as well in our organizations, big, small, whatever. And so I want to be relatively agnostic to the kind of crisis. So you'll hear me elaborate on that a little bit more. Don't want to ignore the pandemic, but also want to make sure that we cover other kinds of crises as well. And again, I'll elaborate much more on that as we move along. And finally, there's really 2 parts to the presentation today. The first will be a bit more of a refresher, perhaps covering some territory that you may have heard before, although I like to think that there's a little bit of something for everybody in the presentation, no matter how crisis prepared your organization is. So I'll cover that at the beginning. That'll be sort of the shorter portion. And then the second part will be a bit more inside baseball on crisis communications and giving you a glimpse as to what are some of the contemporary issues that we're facing as crisis managers and communicators for that matter, and how you might be better prepared for that as an organization. So with that as a preamble, let's go ahead and get rolling, get right into the presentation material. I'm just going to take a quick AV moment here and share my slides. And if I'm not on the right one, I will go back. Let's see, I'm going to hit share there. I'm going to make sure that you can see the slideshow view, which is that one. Whoops. All right. Okay, great. So again, welcome. Let's get started. So crisis communications is our topic today. And you know, when we talk about crisis, There's really a number of terms that are thrown around that you may or may not have heard in the past, that crises for organizations are really truly make or break moments, right? Depending on our ability to handle them and communicate, can either make or break public perception and stakeholder reaction and things like that. Secondly, that we're under the microscope in a crisis, right? We're never more scrutinized than when we're dealing with and responding to a crisis. And I absolutely have come to believe that, again, in my career working at organizations, agencies, nonprofits, other people. I've just seen the scrutiny level go up and up. So that's certainly the case. That we've got to be consistent in a crisis. Consistency is a term you will often hear. Transparency. Today's stakeholders, whether they be employees, customers, citizens, whoever it might be, they're really demanding a level of transparency that we haven't seen before. Certainly in my field, in communications, public relations, things like that, and where we measure these kinds of things. Transparency desire is off the charts. And in a crisis, that desire for transparency, frankly, gets magnified. We need to be accountable in a crisis, no question about it. Corrective actions that we take as crisis managers, crisis communicators are important to communicate clearly. Advanced planning, we'll talk a lot today about advanced planning. Things like that. So again, just kind of getting us using this slide to sort of get our minds wrapped around this topic of crisis management, and more specifically crisis communications. And those are really, I think, in many ways, it's important to say those are two connected but separated activities, right? We're managing the crisis at the same time we're communicating with the crisis. And depending on our organization, we may have different teams doing that, or we may have the same team doing both of those activities. So that sort of puts us where we are from just kind of a level set perspective. Today's risk environment is very highly charged, I would say, right? No matter where we are, what type of organization, certainly common risks and things we would think about, whether those be weather events, what have you, are often in place. But depending on our kinds of organization, really no one is immune to either an external type of crisis that comes at us or even an internal crisis that may happen internally in our organization. And so, I've yet to meet the organization that is immune from crises. And I think certainly we could all agree on that. And even organizations that heretofore may have not dealt with crisis, certainly we're seeing that in pandemic, but even external types of things. The logo down there on the bottom right, a good friend of mine was the communications director for an organization called the Jewish Community Center in suburban Kansas City. And I can guarantee you, he never expected that they would be having, this was about 4 or 5 years ago, that they would be having a talent show on a Saturday afternoon, and a white supremacist would drive into their parking lot and begin shooting things up and kill 2 people. That was nowhere in his consideration set before that event. And now I can assure you that organization has a much more robust crisis management and communications plan. So no one's immune. Crises can be different by type of organization. We'll talk some about that, but the risk environment is as highly charged as it really has ever been. Important in management of crisis, but also communication, is that good assessment of potential risk leads to good planning. And we'll talk a lot about planning, but I want to just cover this piece around having a robust process to assess your risk and anticipate your crises. And that's done in different ways in different organizations. I came from the corporate world. A lot of times, we would have a risk management department, for instance, that could be very helpful to us as crisis communicators to think about, well, what are the kinds of things we should be planning for? Your organization may not be that large. That risk assessment piece may rest in different parts of the organization. But as communicators and crisis managers, we need to have our hands around that, right? We need to understand what is good assessment, because that's going to lead to better planning. And it helps us get off the page of our crisis plan and more into the routine as we understand the kinds of crisis that might potentially befall our organization. And you do this through things like review of your crisis plan, methodical drilling, practice, training, things like that. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments. Many people in your organization, or many of the organizations, I should say, that are with us today, may already have a good crisis communications plan, which is great. I too frequently, however, I will tell you that I run into organizations where they don't have a robust plan. I can remember actually being hired by a fairly large company and walking in on the first day and asking my boss where the crisis communications plan was. His response was, "What crisis communications plan?" To which I replied, "I now know what I'll be doing for the next 3 months," because this was an organization that, believe me, needed a high level of planning and assessment and really didn't have one. But I want to make this presentation sort of beneficial whether you do or do not currently have a plan. What I would say is that if you don't have a plan, and in a few moments, I'll go through what a good plan looks like. There are some really good templates out there. Many of them are just available on the web from some very highly respected communications organizations. And so if you don't have a good crisis communications plan, point being, you're able to typically find a good template or resource for building one just available on the web. And there are several good ones that are easily searched. The first step in any plan, however, whether I'm working for that big corporation or a small organization or a municipality, is to identify the most likely risks. No question about it. That's, until we get a handle on what our risks are, it's hard for us to plan for those and obviously communicate around those as well. I would always say too that many times the importance of the organizational will is absolutely vital, right? The organization has to commit to the concept of quality crisis management, quality crisis communications. I'd love to tell you that organizational will is there for everybody. Now, in this third bullet, I would tell you that maybe things have changed a bit since the spring 2020 global pandemic. But too frequently, I see organizations that, for whatever reason, they get busy with other things. They're growing. They've got other strategic initiatives, and it's easy to bury our heads in the sand on something like crisis. And you have to make sure that your organization and its leadership is there with you. And then, lastly, on planning, and you'll notice this as you look online if you don't currently have a plan, or if you want to update your current plan, that a lot of the good templates are very detailed. They don't skimp on the content. They're extremely comprehensive. And again, I want to show you an example on that here in just a moment. And so when we think about planning, I mentioned we want to get our arms around kind of what are the potential disasters that are out there. This slide is actually about, 3 or 4 years old now. I need to update it a bit because it puts potential crises in two columns: internal crisis or external crisis. Internal meaning issues that rise to crisis status and come from within our own organization. So think about that. So these are fairly easily understood things that come from inside. So as you look at this slide, it could be things like a shortage of supply, or even some misconduct or malfeasance within our own organization, employee misconduct, internal breaches of security, whether they be IT or otherwise, again, originating from the inside. Think of this almost as sort of like internal kind of terrorism, which we've seen, unfortunately, more and more in large organizations. We have to be careful of that. So there are all these internal types of crises originating within, and then there are external crises. And as I mentioned, the slide is a bit old because one thing that you see fire and natural disasters and things like that. I would argue now that even replacing fire as number one might be health issue, right? Major health issue, global pandemic, absolutely should go on this list and would be external. But the point is, on external, these are things that are originating from outside of our organization that are then impacting us and that we have to deal with to one degree or another. And certainly the most common one, actually pandemic is on there. I'm sorry, look, that's better than I thought, right down there toward the bottom. We'll move that up in a future slide. But absolutely, that would be a crisis that would fit the definition of external. There are other kinds of external things that you may not think about as much. Investigation by government or regulatory agencies. Certainly, a lot of companies that I was with would worry quite a bit about that. Utility types of failures, particularly if we're an organization, a municipality, a large company, things like that. Utilities are a big one. mass casualty incidents. They're down toward the bottom. Certainly something that we maybe didn't think about in the past as much, but certainly kind of in the last 20 years or so, we've seen more and more mass shootings and things like that, which would be external. So don't want to belabor this list, but just want to get you in the mindset of understanding that there are internal and external crises, and we need to be really aware of both of them and sort of where those crises originate. The other thing I would say while we're on this topic of evaluating your risk is that there are some really good tools out there to help you do that. So here's one that I use for students. That is, I teach crisis communications. This is developed by Professor Fern Banks from the Pacific Northwest, I believe, where she says what you need to do is you need to make that list that I showed on the previous slide, and then you need to judge each one of those across two planes, right? You need to judge them on what's the probability, right? If you look in the bottom right here, and I'll explain the graph in a second, what's the probability of this happening, pandemic or fire or whatever it might be, internal. And then in the other plane that you're going to measure these against is what's the potential damage, right? Because some crises, whether they're internal or external, could have low levels of damage, some could have very high levels, right? And so you will see that on probability, it's a scale, 0 to 5, and that's actually, I'll explain the graph here in a second to the right. And then from a damage perspective, we go from no damage or serious consequences. And then you'll notice that because she's speaking for communicators here, as the damage level goes up, considerable damage, devastating, et cetera, she puts that in the context of what kind of attention might we get from, say, media in a situation like that, because as communicators, we're often thinking about how is the media going to react. If it's little damage, it's probably not serious enough. If it's devastating, now all of a sudden it's front page news, right? If your CFO is absconded with all of the company money, as I remember from an organization years ago, that was pretty devastating to them. Even though they didn't feel like the probability was high, the damage was extremely high. So you want to judge them on both planes. And so then you'll see over here, this was an example pulled from her textbook, that as she looked at different types of crises, workplace, fire for this organization, protest, negative legislation, that it was a different level, right? So the white bars, for instance, negative legislation was a high probability for this organization, but they saw it as causing relatively low damage, or in their instance, from a communications perspective, not getting a lot of media attention. Whereas if you'll look at, say, workplace violence, not only do they rate it a high probability, I think this happened to be like a factory or that kind of thing, they also had it as extremely damaging from a reputation or a media kind of a perspective. So I love this tool. Again, I recommend it to organizations. It's one that you can do fairly easily on your own. I've seen big organizations that have risk kind of assessment implement this into their risk assessment techniques, but just put more of a crisis communications planning spin on it. But anyway, submitted for your approval, and hopefully something that you could use in your organization as you're thinking about risk overall. There are some other good tools as well. And again, I see a lot of these come across as I work in the field. This is another framework for just helping you conceptualize risk in your organization. I keep this in my plan, and then I actually list which types of crisis would fit in which sector of this chart that you see. It's sort of a traditional likelihood priority kind of graph with the items in the bottom lower, the low priority. These are things that our communications team, that happened to be a crisis communications plan I was writing, could handle just as the events occur, versus the high likelihood, upper right, high priority types of crises, where we're creating very detailed response plans. We're having regular meetings to discuss. We're probably doing some training and drills, things like that. So this could be another good tool for you to use as, and again, fairly easy to develop and include in your crisis planning and your crisis communication sorts of efforts. All right, so as we talk about risk and assessing risk, then I want to switch to, again, in this first part of the presentation, to, we're building the house at this point. We're building our communications responsibilities within the crisis management structure. Where do we begin? And obviously, where we begin is with a good crisis communications plan. As I mentioned earlier, good templates out there. For those of you who've not seen a good plan, I wanted to show you just a table of contents from an organization that I actually worked with a few years ago. And as I mentioned, these things are very, very detailed. They're very comprehensive. So here I just pulled the table of contents. This was actually a 3-ring binder that was about 2 inches thick a few years ago. Now that would be both hard copy and electronic, as it was then actually as well. But it's usually broken up by parts. So if you'll see, there's an introduction. There's a part 1 where we're going to talk about our philosophy as an organization, guidelines, definitions. We talked about how communications differed. This organization actually already had an emergency operations crisis management plan. So we're saying, how is communications and the management plan going to work together? So that's in that 4th line there. We talked a little bit about just our philosophy of dealing with crisis, that we wanted to be transparent, that we wanted to be consistent. You sort of build this narrative so that anybody can pick it up and read it and immediately like if you're hiring a new employee, for instance, in your communications or in your operations field, and you want them to be familiar with this plan, it would be written for them. Our objectives, who's on our crisis communications team, very important. Obviously, not just who's on the team, but how do we contact them? Extremely important when the fire hits. Different types of crisis. This might be where we talk a crisis typology. This might be where we talk about internal versus external, and maybe even likelihood, using that Fern Banks tool that I showed earlier. Then the second part is around our procedures for communications. This organization used a phased approach where we're going to identify the issue in phase 1. We're going to plan for how we're going to handle it on the fly in phase 2, using our plan, but putting the specifics for that crisis together. Then we're going to actually respond and do our tactical execution in phase 3. And then in phase 4, evaluation and measurement. Evaluation and measurement, extremely important in crisis management, crisis communications, right? That's that after action, that hot wash, whatever you want to call it, where we go back and we look at how we did, we evaluate it, we measure it against, what we thought in the beginning, and we frankly capture our learnings that we can, and I've never seen a crisis pass where there aren't learnings. So that B, or part 2D down at the bottom, extremely important. But they used a 4-phased approach, which if you go online and look at some templates, a lot of them use that kind of configuration. The third part was, you'll notice this is just a very long list. This was critical reference information. So this is just kind of the de facto list that really all crisis communications plans have. Several checklists, matrices, contact lists. You'll see there, D, news media contact list. I operated for much of my career in a large market, in the Kansas City market, where we would often have media changing, right? So someone on my team would be responsible for going back to the list and every 6 months and making sure the contacts were the same. And even on 6 months, the media turns over very quickly. So we would do a lot of changing in that number D there. Look at this, media gathering locations, right? So in the plan, we really want to think through all eventualities. And when media begins showing up, where are we going to have them gather? For a large organization, municipality, company, multiple facilities, we want to have the media controlled. We want them to gather in a certain spot. It's our job to make sure that that's handled and that's contemplated in the plan. Command center locations. This organization happened to have multiple facilities. So number G there, planning relationships. Here's where they spoke about, now how are we going to deal with things like other organizations we relate to? Could be law enforcement. Could be other nearby neighbors, whether those be companies, municipalities, organizations, whatever. And then lots of materials and equipment, log sheets, various log sheets, templates, so that as we develop things like maybe news releases, press releases around the crisis, we have a template ready to go. It's built right into the plan. And then contact lists, compliance plan, assessment chart, et cetera, et cetera. Again, lots of detail in these crisis communications plan. I just gave you a high level overview of what was a 2-inch binder, but you get the idea for just exactly how detailed these things are. So after we've developed the plan, one issue that we have is that many times the organization will do the plan, and the plan will be great. It will contemplate all of these various things. It'll sit on a shelf and it will begin to gather dust, right? Which frankly, does that do us very good if our plan is just simply drawing dust? Absolutely not. We have to keep it alive. We have to keep it alive. So a couple of years ago, actually a colleague of mine, a lady by the name of Eileen Holly, who was an adjunct professor at KU, her husband was actually led the aerospace division in the engineering school. Eileen spent about 15 years at NASA in Houston as their director of communications. And believe me, if there's an organization that's ready for crisis, it's NASA. And she worked a couple of large crises while she was there. Her husband, Steve Holly, who ran the aerospace, was actually astronaut Steve Holly, who flew in the space shuttle. So Eileen had a lot of experience around the crisis topic and crisis planning specifically. And so we developed a presentation we called Don't Let Your Crisis Plan Gather Dust, right? How do you keep it alive? And the answer to how you keep it alive is you work the plan. And you do that through practice and drills. There's a couple types of drills that I like to recommend to organizations. The first is what we would call a pretty simple tabletop drill. So we find one of our high probability, high damage events in that first bullet, and then we build a little one-page narrative about it. Here's what's happened. We've had a fire or strike our community, our company, whatever it is. We develop the narrative around that, but we make sure that it's a high probability, high damage. So in other words, it's something that is more likely to happen as opposed to less likely to happen, because we wouldn't want to be spending time on it if not. Then we get everybody around the table, truly tabletop. You've probably seen some things very similar to this. We describe the situation and background, the current state. We kind of go through our narrative. We stick only to what we know to be true, so that they have to kind of think on their feet a little bit. And then by the way, around the table are our organizational leaders, our functional leaders, certainly our communicators, and we have discussion, right? And the discussion is around questions like, what would I in my role be doing in this situation? And I literally say that. I would say, well, I'm the director of HR, and so I would be in charge of accountability for all of our employees, first of all, making sure everybody is safe, beginning to learn about any issues we have from an absence perspective or away from the workplace, whatever it might be. That's what I'd be doing, okay? And then who would be my key contacts? And then in my functional role, I would talk about who I would be interfacing with, right? It's another word for just saying who would I be interfacing with? And then what resources would I need, right? If I'm the HR director, I'm going to need the database of the employees, including their home phone numbers, yada, yada. And by doing the tabletop drill, we're able to determine if our plan is in fact robust. And many times it gets sort of an evaluation check for us to say, no, we really didn't contemplate that we would need, whatever, two-way radios in XYZ facility. There was a point that came out in our after action on the tabletop that brought that out. And so we're able to then enter it back into the plan. See what I mean? So it's a great tool, not only to keep our team kind of on their toes, even from a verbal perspective, but also to identify potential new things that we should be doing within the organization. We also may craft a statement or review likely media questions. So there's a very specific communications element to this tabletop drill as well. Certainly our communicators would be with us around the table. And so it becomes both a management and a communications exercise to do, again, the tabletop drill. The second drill that we use very frequently, when I was at big organizations, we would do this at least twice a year, and I actually had a CEO that wanted us to do this 4 times a year, is what we call the live simulation. So this is the second type of practice, if you will. Also very important. These are live action, live fire. So we are, I say live, it's not actually happening, it's simulated, but we're doing it in real time. Okay, so same thing, we're going to find a crisis that works for this kind of drill, and then we're going to do it over, it's a multi-day scenario. So instead of just sort of a 1 page, this one might be 4 or 5 pages because we're defining what might be the situation on day 1, day 2, day 3. Many times we're bringing in an outside consultant. So I've actually done this for some organizations where I'll come in and make sure that we have a scenario that's ready to go across multi-days in the simulation time, but then we will compress it and build the training in a hypothetical nature so that it's a full day in length. Does that make sense? It unfolds in stages, right? So we sort of have the beginning elements of the crisis, and then what's happened as the crisis has sort of moved along. So it's unfolding in stages. Participants usually work in their real life roles. So again, the HR person is playing the HR role, the communicator is playing the communicator role, and they may have specific narratives written for them. There are multiple planned interruptions. So, what starts out as sort of maybe a smaller brewing crisis quickly erupts over the course of the day. This is always a lot of fun, if any of you have done one of these, to kind of keep up with the changes that are thrown at you, these planned interruptions. And, as an example, it might be, well, we thought we had the crisis under control. Now all of a sudden we've had some social media rumors come up that maybe we haven't done a good job, and how are we going to react to those, et cetera. Very important for communicators. Often culminates with a mock press conference, or sometimes you'll do a series of 1 or 2 press conferences. I just did a simulation with a group of students the other day, and we actually did 3 mock press conferences over Zoom, which was very interesting. And you're going to do those press conferences, but then you're going to record them. And the reason you're going to record them is so that once again you can go back and judge yourself, which you either do on your own, or sometimes the consultant, if you're using one, can help you with that. These are fairly elaborate, as you can tell, types of things. They take a lot of time to plan. Frankly, they take of usually at least a full day to execute. These are not things to be taken lightly, because they're going to take some resource. I will tell you, it is very well worth the resource spent. And I'll explain a couple of examples of that later. It finishes with a detailed debrief where we really say, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, right? And believe me, there's, unlike the tabletop, the live simulation often yields some very substantial holes in our plan, or things we could do differently. I happen to think the live simulation is sort of the gold standard for crisis preparation. And as Eileen Holly and I made this presentation to organizations, that's often what we would say is that if you're not doing a live simulation at least once a year, more likely 2 would be better, just because you're going to be able to cover more of your potential events that way. Okay, let's see. Just one last thing on designing these trainings, if you're interested in them. You want to choose the scenarios, as I mentioned earlier, that are going to have the greatest impact. So those that are both high probability and high damage, that's what you're going to choose for these trainings. The scripting, I mentioned that, building the narrative, whether you're doing a tabletop or certainly a live simulation, you're going to build the narrative with rich details about what the crisis involves. You're going to give background, you're going to give timing, you're going to do those planned interruptions, if you have them, changing elements within the crisis. Oh my gosh, we've just had a group of demonstrators come up to the gates of City Hall or the company or whatever it is, and you're throwing that at the team working the crisis sort of as it goes along. And then very importantly, obviously, you can't have a good drill without a good after action post-mortem evaluation. So how did we do? It almost always produces really good edits then to your crisis communications or your crisis management plan, for that matter. I would say these drills are typically contemplated for both the managers of the crisis and the communicators of the crisis. So these we are doing together. When I was a director of communications, sometimes I would drill my own team just from the communication standpoint. Does that make sense? So you can use the tool in various ways. Typically, it's done, though, with everybody around the table who's going to be both managing and also communicating the crisis. Pretty important. All right, so that's a bit on just keeping that training live. And just one more point that I wanted to mention about Eileen. I mentioned that she was at NASA for a number of years, so I stole one of her slides here with her permission, of course, for this presentation. So Eileen was at NASA in the early 2000s and happened to be the lead communicator on staff there for the shuttle Columbia disaster when Columbia broke up in the atmosphere as it was re-entering Earth and lost all 8, I believe, astronauts on the flight. It was the second large disaster for NASA, and so Eileen gives a really very interesting account of, it was the second shuttle disaster, actually. Challenger had been, whatever that was, 16 years prior. And what she talks about is just the value of learning in crisis, and how, if you've seen documentaries, the Space Shuttle Challenger was typically in the mid 80s, was was known as a crisis that was not handled very well, particularly from a communications perspective. There was a lot of secrecy. There was a lack of transparency on the management side. There were a number of issues with that crisis. But Columbia was actually handled much better, much more transparent, much more better involvement with media and transparency and consistency and work with media, and leadership in place that really understood the value and had learned from that accident of a few years before to actually build a much better and more robust response. So if you ever get a chance to hear Eileen talk about that, really does a fantastic job. But even in that situation, you know, the photo there in the lower level, there were things that they didn't contemplate in their plan, right? One was just the outpouring of emotion, as we often see from things like mass shootings and things like that, from stakeholders and frankly from the public in this case, and that their front gate to NASA was just inundated with flowers and cakes and all kinds of, you name it, right? And so the managers looked at her and said, "Your communications, you handle it," right? So she had to figure out, how do we respond to this outpouring of grief and really do it in a way that's going to you know, acknowledge the feelings of the stakeholders, but also be meaningful and not, you know, crowd our gate to the point that we can't get vehicles in and out. So little things like that, which seem small, but in a crisis of this magnitude and with this much scrutiny, anytime you have a mass casualty kind of event, you're going to be heavily scrutinized no matter what your organization. So just wanted to throw that in as a short story to, again, illustrate the importance of how we can learn in a crisis. And there's some really good documentaries out, particularly about the Challenger disaster, but also Columbia, that I would recommend for you. So that's the end of the first part of the presentation. Again, covering kind of some of these basic blocking and tackling things. With that, I'm going to leave the presentation here. I hope that you got an opportunity to enjoy it. I'll leave the screen up just for a couple more minutes. That's my email at KU, my Twitter handle. I often tweet on crisis topics if you want to follow me there. And then there's my website where I will work with organizations, groups on their own crisis communications plans from time to time. So with that, I'm going to leave it. I hope the rest of the conference is productive for you. Thanks for your time and attention today. Absolutely feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any help to you in the future. And have a good rest of your day and as you move along in your crisis preparation efforts. Thanks a lot. Take care.